Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who thought they could throw their weight around and discovered that authority doesn't protect you from consequences. One involves a manager who demanded a sweater come off in a freezer, another a VP who insisted on 3 months ahead deadlines, and the last a dockyard worker who learned that 650 acres is a long walk. Here we go. My boss demanded I remove my sweater in the freezer. This is technically my boyfriend's story, not mine, but he gave me full permission to share it because, in his words, he's too lazy to make his own account. He told it to me with the biggest grin on his face and opened with, "My boss learned today who not to be petty with." That alone should tell you exactly the kind of energy he brought to this shift. If you know him personally, you already know he has zero patience for arbitrary power trips. If you don't know him, just imagine someone who will follow rules so precisely that it becomes a weapon. He works retail, the kind of store with a backroom maze of coolers, freezers, stock shelves, and a tiny break room wedged between it all. On this particular day, he was working in the back, nowhere near customers, bouncing between the freezer and the break room to restock items. It was freezing in there, and since he wasn't on the sales floor, he had his own plain sweater on over his shirt. Nothing offensive, nothing inappropriate, just something warm enough to keep him from turning into a popsicle while hauling boxes. He planned to take it off before heading back out front. Enter his manager, who'd apparently woken up that morning craving a minor confrontation. She walked into the back, spotted the sweater, and immediately said, "That's not corporate approved." He calmly explained that he was only in the back for about 15 minutes and would remove it before returning to the floor. He even pointed out that no customers could see him. She wasn't interested in reason. "Take it off now," she insisted, doubling down like she'd caught him embezzling funds instead of wearing knit fabric. So he did. No argument, no dramatic sigh, just a nod, and the sweater came off. The thing about my boyfriend is that once you pull the corporate policy card, he will happily play it back at you with interest. He knows that employee handbook better than most of the supervisors do. If we're going to be technical, then let's be very technical. About an hour later, he was restocking the freezer again without the sweater. Every few minutes, he had to step out because he was physically shivering. He'd walk into the hallway, rub his arms, wait until he could feel his fingers again, then go back in. After about 20 minutes of this cycle, the same manager wandered over and watched him do it for a minute. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "Stocking the freezer," he replied, completely straight-faced. "But it's pretty cold in there." She stared at him like he'd just informed her that water is wet. "Well, why don't you grab one of the jackets and gloves?" she said, clearly annoyed at the inefficiency. That was when he delivered it. "Oh," he said casually, "because if you read the employee handbook, those jackets and gloves technically aren't corporate approved either. The cooler jackets they keep on hooks, not officially listed. The freezer gloves, same story." She blinked at him, realizing exactly what he was doing. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't raising his voice, he was complying with her logic. She grumbled something under her breath and walked away. He continued his freezer dance, stepping out every 5 to 10 minutes to maintain safe working conditions, as he later phrased it to me with exaggerated seriousness. Productivity dropped, but policy was intact. If warmth wasn't corporate approved, then neither was efficiency. This is the part that kills me. She told him to follow the rules, so he did. She forgot the rules, also say nothing about jackets. He's not being difficult, he's just being consistent. And now her shift is falling apart because she picked the wrong thing to enforce. An hour and a half later, she came storming back. "I've been trying to reach you over the communication system for the last 20 minutes, she snapped. "Why aren't you responding?" He looked down at the earpiece sitting unused on the shelf. "Oh," he said, feigning realization. "That's because those aren't corporate approved either." The store's radio system, like the jackets and gloves, had never actually been formally cleared in writing. She stared at him like she was deciding whether to scream or laugh. "You're really going to be this petty?" she demanded. He didn't even flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied. "I'm just following corporate standards." That was the line that broke her. For the remainder of his 7-hour shift, he operated exactly within the narrowest interpretation of every written rule. If it wasn't explicitly approved, he didn't touch it. No unofficial shortcuts, no practical solutions, no bending for convenience. When something slowed down because of that rigidity, he simply shrugged and reminded anyone who asked that he was adhering to policy. By the end of the shift, the manager approached him again, but this time the edge was gone. She looked exhausted, like someone who'd just spent hours wrestling with her own decision. "I get it," she said finally. "Okay, I need to know how to pick my battles." He met her eyes and said, "You absolutely do." When he told me that part, I nearly spit out my drink. If I didn't know him personally, I might have thought he was embellishing. But I do know him, and that's exactly something he would say without blinking. He doesn't go looking for fights, but if someone insists on enforcing nonsense, he'll comply so thoroughly that they'll rethink the nonsense. Apparently, since that day, she's been a little more selective about what hills she chooses to die on. Funny how quickly corporate approved becomes flexible when it's inconvenient for management. And our second story. We followed my manager's rules so perfectly that he removed himself from oversight entirely. I work as a senior graphic designer for a company for 5 years now. Originally, it was only a team of 3, a marketing manager, a marketing executive, and myself. The former 2 have since quit, and you'll find out later why. A huge part of my job is to handle a huge advertising schedule in a project management system, PMS, for which I design print/digital ads for. Enter my difficult micromanaging manager. He's the VP of Sales and Marketing who's been with the company for 30-plus years. His way of quality control is to force all our marketing materials to go through an approval process in our PMS in which everyone else has to give their feedback, and only then will my manager give the final sign-off once it reaches him. On top of that, he insists on being copied on every notification for every single step of the way. So every single ad I produced had to be sent through our PMS while tagging the product managers and proofreaders. Those individuals would then comment feedback for changes needed, or if the ad is approved, they'd mark it complete and then send it along to the next person. It would end with this micromanaging manager who'd have the final say on whether it's good to be sent out or not. Sometimes the process would be flawless, as everyone would approve it the first time with no changes needed, but when it got to my manager, he'd reject it and I'd have to do it over pending his remarks. The thing with our PMS is that you can see timestamps of when people viewed updates. He's on our project board, so he gets all the updates, and he could have easily interceded earlier and let me know if changes were needed to pass his check so I'd not waste my time. But because of the way he is, he only wants to see the final drafts after everyone else sees them. Everyone else always seems to move things along in a timely fashion, but when it finally gets to my manager, he'd just let it sit, and then you'd have to constantly check to see if he marked it off. When I pushed back and stated how arduous this all is, his tone-deaf reply was to have it done 3 months in advance. He also insisted that the ads I produced have to look different each time for each publication's insertion order. So after 4 years of handling all this by myself, I was barely meeting deadlines, and the quality of my work started slipping as I was making really stupid mistakes. Every few months, I'd ask my manager if we're going to hire an additional designer for our department since we're doing more marketing, and every year I'd hear, "It's not in our budget right now." Things came to a head during one of my biannual reviews, where I told my manager bluntly, in front of HR, that we desperately needed to hire an additional designer, as there was no way for me to hit the 3-month-ahead goal that he keeps parroting. He actually asked me, and I quote, "Is it typical for companies to have more than one graphic designer?" I'm dead serious. I showed him how I handled everything by myself as best I could at that point, and I was getting burnt out. For those that may ask why I stay, they compensate me very well without having to commute into a major metropolitan city. A golden handcuff situation, if you will. By the end of the meeting, my manager finally caved and gave me permission to hire an additional designer who started with us this past January. While showing him the ropes on our design systems, he told me the manager said something snarky to him along the lines of, "I never imagined having to hire 2 designers. You guys should have no problem being 3 months ahead on ads now." Are you kidding me? Over the years, I watched my manager as he hired a plethora of account executives and replacements for our department, most of whom quit within months under his watch. But he's going to give me crap for needing 1 designer after I made things work for 4 years by myself? I was so infuriated by his comments that I decided he wants ads done 3 months in advance? Okay, bet. 4 years of doing it alone, and he has the nerve to act like hiring one more person is some huge favor? Then he makes that snarky comment to the new guy? He basically dared you to prove him wrong, and you took the dare. I trained the new designer on our approach to the advertising schedule and the PMS and the ins and outs of the approval process, and we went to work. We both proceeded to bury my manager in notifications as we churned out ad after ad after ad, pushing items through the pipeline with my manager receiving notifications on every single update. When the tasks ended at him and we got no response, we set up automations to ping him every hour calling for his approval. We also would send detailed weekly reports stating our progress and also made it inherently clear to mention our goal was to be 3 months ahead of deadlines. By this past May, in time for one of my biannual reviews, my manager made an announcement. He announced my coworker, the marketing assistant, would be promoted to the vacant marketing manager position. Furthermore, they would now be handling the advertising schedule and be the final point person going forward. My manager also asked to have all notifications for him be removed as he didn't have the bandwidth anymore to monitor it and is taking a step back from overseeing us. We collectively broke my manager after only 5 months of doing exactly what he asked. And I've got to say, things have improved greatly so far. Our new marketing manager is very laid back, and we're still getting things done ahead of schedule, and he's really good at what he does. We've also since hired 2 more additional employees for our department, and we've been steadily growing. My newly promoted coworker recently joked with me and the junior designer about how he wanted to go over the advertising schedule for next year with our manager, but he elected to not see anything and fully trusted my coworker to handle it completely on his own. Funny how that works. And our last story. If you scratch it, I'll know. The last words of a man who didn't realize I was about to make him walk 650 acres. Many years ago, I was serving in the Royal Navy as a very junior officer, the kind who says yes sir a lot and spends most of his time running errands for people with more stripes on their sleeves. At the time, my ship was alongside at HMNB Devonport in Plymouth, the largest naval base in Western Europe. Devonport's enormous, stretching roughly 2 miles from end to end, and when your ship is berthed at the southernmost jetty, every trip across base can feel like a small expedition. Through a mixture of luck and being in the right place at the right time, I'd managed to secure something almost mythical, a mobile car pass. For a sub-lieutenant, that pass was gold dust, as it allowed me to park in almost any available space and save me hours of walking. The pass was displayed in the windscreen and clearly showed my rank, name, and vehicle registration. It was designed for flexibility and was highly sought after by junior officers constantly being sent on gopher missions across base. On the morning in question, I just returned from one such errand and attempted to park near the jetty by my ship. Unfortunately, the usual spaces were full, and after circling once, I found a clear parking bay outside a nearby workshop. There were no signs reserving it, no painted names, nothing indicating it belonged to anyone in particular, so I pulled in and returned to the ship without another thought. A couple of hours later, I was dispatched again, this time accompanied by another junior officer. We stepped out off the gangway in our uniforms and headed toward my car. As we rounded the corner, I saw a white van parked directly behind mine, neatly blocking me in. At first, I assumed it was a delivery vehicle and the driver would be back shortly. Still, time was ticking, so I decided to ask around. I walked into the adjacent workshop and approached the first civilian contractor I saw, a man in oil-stained overalls. "Excuse me," I said politely, "do you know whose van that is outside?" He glanced toward the door and replied, "Yeah, mate, that's Dan's." I asked where I might find Dan, explaining that his van was blocking my car. Without missing a beat, the contractor bellowed across the workshop, "Dan! That Navy C-word's here about his car!" Out of a side office emerged a mountain of a man, also in grimy overalls, with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting all week for an argument. "You parked in my effing space, you effing C-word," he roared. I was fairly certain it wasn't his space, but escalating the situation with a man built like a brick wall seemed unwise. "I'm sorry," I replied evenly. "I didn't realize. Could you move your van so I can get out, please?" He crossed his arms. "Nope, I'm on my lunch break, and I don't do any work for you Navy lot on my lunch break." It was 10:30 in the morning. I asked when he might move it, and he said, "When I go home. Now, F off." That was the moment I realized brute force or reason wouldn't work. What I needed was creativity. He could have just moved the van, 5 minutes of his time. Instead, he decided to be a wall about it. 10:30 is not lunch. He just wanted to make someone feel small. That's the kind of person who needs a long walk to think about their choices. I put on my most conciliatory expression and said, "Look, clearly we've started off badly. You're on your break and I shouldn't have parked there. How about this? Give me your keys and I'll move your van. I'll move my car out and then park your van properly for you." Dan looked at me suspiciously, clearly weighing up whether this was a trap. Eventually, perhaps reassured by my uniform and calm tone, he tossed me the keys. "Fine, if you scratch it, I'll know." Outside, I tossed my own car keys to my colleague and said quietly, "Follow me." I pulled the van forward to free my car, and once he was clear, I set off. Instead of neatly repositioning the van nearby, I drove toward the far end of the dockyard. Devonport covers roughly 650 acres, and from one end to the other is a good 3 to 4 miles by road. I parked the van in a cluster of similar white vans near a remote building at the opposite extremity of the base. Then I hopped back into my own car and we returned to the workshop. I walked back inside and handed Dan his keys. He looked annoyed. "Took your effing time? Never driven a van before?" I shrugged lightly and said, "Only done a couple of miles in one before. It's all a bit new to me." He grunted, pocketed the keys, and told me not to park in his space again. I assured him I wouldn't. That afternoon, our ship sailed. I never saw Dan again and never heard what became of his search for the van. Given the size of the base, I imagine he had quite the walk before realizing it wasn't simply around the corner. At the very least, he would have spent a good portion of his afternoon wandering 650 acres looking for a vehicle that had been relocated with great care. I like to think he had plenty of time to reflect on the value of basic courtesy while doing so. If there's one thing these 3 stories prove, it's that management often forgets rules apply both ways. Story 1 was policy as a mirror. The manager demanded compliance with corporate standards. The boyfriend complied so perfectly that productivity ground to a halt. No jackets, no radios, no efficiency, just shivering and freezer breaks. By the end of her shift, she was begging him to stop. He didn't. He just reminded her she'd started it. Story 2 was systemic overload. The VP wanted ads 3 months ahead, a ridiculous demand from someone who sat on approvals for weeks, so the OP and his new hire flooded the pipeline. Notifications every hour, weekly reports hammering home 3 months ahead. 5 months later, the VP removed himself from oversight entirely. He didn't have the bandwidth anymore. Funny how that works. But story 3 takes the prize, not because of the prank, though driving a man's van to the far end of a 650-acre naval base is legendary, but because of the walk. Dan had hours to think about his choices, hours to wander past buildings and docks, searching for a van he'd handed over to prove a point. And the OP? He sailed away that afternoon, never to return. The last image is perfect. A massive man in oily overalls trudging through Plymouth, realizing somewhere around mile 3 that maybe, just maybe, he should have just moved the damn van. Which story had the best entitled person takedown? Vote in the comments, 1, 2, or 3.